aspect of the expression of identities of all these multicultural communities. So there are two ways of approaching multiculturalism. There are two ways of understanding multilingualism. So you can either refer to people or to places. So if you think about multilingualism as related to people, we think that people are multilingual if they have competences in a number of languages, just like we here, right? And if we think about places, if you think about your context, so you can say that there are multilingual places if in those places there are many languages used, right? Of course, we could open here some discussion, some introduction of ideas, because we have different societies here. I know definitely Spain has linguistic issues, different from Portugal, different from Turkey, different from the Netherlands, right? So you do have to consider how you are going to approach multilingualism. Are we talking about people or are we talking about places? So, in order to distinguish these two aspects of multilingualism, which is people and places, the Council of Europe proposed a definition for multilingualism and then plurilingualism. So the definition of multilingualism emphasizes that idea of place, places where multiple languages are used and spoken. So, their definition of multilingualism is the presence in a geographical area, and we highlight geographical area, large or small, being in a city, society, nation, or state, of more than one variety of language, right? So it's not only different languages, we may be considering varieties of language, which is to say dialects, right, as well as accents. That is the mode of speaking of a social group, whether it is formally recognized as a language or not. In such an area, individuals may be monolingual, speaking only their own variety. So, even though the place is multilingual, some individuals may not be multilingual, right? They may have only the knowledge of their own variety. As opposed to plurilingualism, then the emphasis is placed on the speaker. The repertoire, the many different languages, varieties of language which many individuals use in their private and or public spheres, and is therefore the opposite of monolingualism. It includes the language variety referred to as mother language or first language, and any number of other languages or varieties of that mother language. Thus, in some multilingual areas, some individuals are multilingual and some are plurilingual, right? So this might be a suggestion of how to deal with concepts, differentiating multilingualism from plurilingualism. So far, we've realized that multilingualism and multiculturalism is exactly about diversity. So diverse realities imply diverse attitudes. And the attitudes, bringing back the idea of the difference between multilingualism and plurilingualism, the individual and society and the community, and that also has to do with the attitudes. So if you are here 30-something people, 35 people, including myself, we would have 30-something different attitudes to multilingualism and to multiculturalism, right? Each one is able to build his or her own attitude, rather sometimes positive, sometimes negative. And of course, this reflects also in the social environment we are part of, right? So again, definitely there would be some differences between the way the Spanish people see multilingualism, the norm, the Spanish language, the Castilian language, and the other official languages, if there are official languages, as much as Portugal, as much as the Netherlands, as much as Turkey, right? There are different attitudes and approaches, and this is the perfect scenario, the perfect stage for you to exchange these ideas, these different concepts on multilingualism, monolingualism, and multiculturalism. So, I don't know if you had the chance to do so, but I think it's a question that we have to keep asking ourselves. How do we, and how our society deals with and sees multilingualism? So basically, the major distinction that we may have among Italy, among Spain, among Portugal, among Turkey, among the Netherlands, has to do with the historical background, right? Because we have here, and I'm sorry if I'm just focusing on European background, but the whole ideology of monolingualism is pretty much recent in terms of history, even though it started in the 15th century with the beginning of the formation of the nation state. Portugal is an example, right? The borders, that are the longest borders existing. So, but not only that, this idea was also reinforced by the French Revolution, the idea of a nation, the idea of a unity of a state, and later on the nationalist movements of the 19th century. Basically, we're talking about European and American contexts here, right? So the more recent rebordering of Europe, right? The new states, the new countries that were formed, they had to have at the same time their own identity expressed in a single language, right? So this was the main source of the monolingualism concept and reinforcement of this unity. So I found this quotation from a German philosopher, theologian, poet, and literary critic from the 18th century, exactly the time that Germany was going through a process of unification, right? Because till then, there was no Germany. There were different communities, different societies. And at that time, in an attempt to come up with a German unity, a German state, Johann von Herder said this: has a people anything dearer than the speech of its fathers? In its speech resides its whole thought domain, its tradition, history, religion, and basis of life, all its heart and soul. The vast culture of a people cannot be expressed through a foreign language. It thrives on the soil of a nation most beautifully, and may I say, it thrives only by means of the nation's inherited and inheritable dialect. With language is created the heart of a people. You see that language, singular, right? There was one standardized language. Languages that had previously been put in terms of a grammar. There's a dictionary, right? So languages that have been unified. So this pretty much summarizes the idea or the importance of monolingualism to societies. So again, reinforcing the idea that monolingualism is recent as opposed to multilingualism. Lo Bianco said, an Italian linguist in Australia, he said that it's easy to forget that multilingualism is historically the norm, and that national monolingualism has been of relatively short historical duration in certain parts of the world only. The reason we talk about pluralism as though it is disrupting something is because we have normalized the idea of that something being the national state. So multilingualism, one of those negative attitudes towards multilingualism is that it's going to destroy the unit of the state, right? That the state exists or subsists and survives because there is one common language unified, right? So other languages are a threat to that unity. So instead of having this conflict between one or two languages or more languages, the further step, and that's what has been going on recently, is the idea of addition. There's no conflict. We can have more. We can add more languages to our one language, to our two languages, to our three languages, right? So there is no threat in multilingualism per se. So, and of course, this threat, this idea of disruption is pretty much represented in many examples throughout the world, right? Not familiar with what happens all over the world, right? But most of us know what happened when, for instance, the English, throughout its colonial history, firstly occupied the British Isles, and bringing with them the English language. So Gaelic almost disappeared in Ireland. It's returning nowadays. The whole problem with Castilian and Catalan, not only in political terms, but we're focusing here on linguistic terms, right? So there's a lot to be said. I'm not going to go deep into these ideas here, but just to bring so these references, these examples, right, of these conflicts. So, and what's with us right now? What's the situation in most countries? Most countries, they recognize only one language for legal and official purposes, even though they may be multilingual. So, and even when they are multilingual or multilingual places, right? Some languages which may be officially recognized, only one is dominant. Because this one is related to social, political, and cultural power of the, I wouldn't say majority, because sometimes it may even be a minority, but it's a minority that holds the power, all elements of power, social, cultural, and political, and the language that represents that community, that group of people, is the one that is dominant, even though there are other languages as well. So, the whole conflict then, putting it in linguistic terms, is that do we have minority languages as a threat to a single national identity? Is it so? The existence of other languages previously, historically, or newly acquired minority languages with, immigration, which is one major social movement, right, of the 21st century. I'm sure your countries have dealt with it, right? Immigrants bringing not only their cultures, but their languages as well. So are they a threat to your national unit, right? So, relating multilingualism with something that is, is easily accepted by some and not so much easily by a few. The idea that English is the world's lingua franca. Well, just to give an example, I'm not speaking Russian to communicate with you. I'm not speaking Chinese. I'm speaking okay, I could, right? But I don't know if everybody would understand. So it's taken for granted that if you want to communicate with a diverse group of people of different nationalities, English should be the choice, right, of language to communicate. And this idea that English is the means of communication between speakers of other languages is exactly what is behind the concept of health of English as a lingua franca, right? So Echo also said some time ago, but pretty much updated, that the predominant position currently enjoyed by English is a historical contingency arising from the mercantile and colonial expansion of the British Empire, which was followed by American economic and technological hegemony. In his quotation, Eco identifies the two major sources of influence of what English is internationally speaking, right? So we have something from the UK, we have something from America, and then we have international English, right? But not only that, we have English influenced by the way that we received and take it for granted that we're all non-native speakers of English, right? Is there any native speaker of English here? English as a first language, mother language? No. Okay, so I don't know how you acquired language. I might have an idea how it was, but what I can say almost for sure is that in your process of acquisition of English, you've had, whether you were conscious of it or not, you had influences from American English and influences from British English, right? Most likely, I'm trying to put it in a very simple explanation. Most likely, you had British influence from school, and you had American influence from outside the school. The movies, the songs, the books you read, whatever, okay? So there's this non-formal learning of American English and formal learning of British English. But not only that, you're not just the result of British English and American English coming up together. You are the result of who you are, the language you speak. So the Spanish ladies here, they speak English from America, from the US, and from their Catalonian, or I'm sorry, it's good that I knew that before, or Spanish background, the language they speak, as much as the Portuguese, as much as the Dutch, right? So the first language that we speak has influence on the way that we use English, and that's exactly the idea of English as a lingua franca. So I was born in Brazil, so I grew up in Brazil first. So I started learning English in Brazil. So a lot of American influence in Brazil, as you might know. Then later on, I moved to the US. I spent some years there, so the American English was pretty much developed there. Then I came to Portugal, and I started listening to Portuguese people speaking English. And then I moved to England, and then I lived in England. So my English is a total mess, right? It's a total mess. So sometimes I see myself using words that are only used in the UK, even though the accent might be similar to American. But then, of course, the intonation is Brazilian Portuguese, right? Because Americans wouldn't sing as much as I do when I speak English, right? So, and I'm giving myself as an example. It's something that happens to you as well. And something that is behind the idea of English as a lingua franca is that you should be proud of it, because this is who you are, because this is your identity, right? Unless you have this multiple personality, striving of becoming just like an American, of speaking English just like the English or the Irish. So if that's your goal, go for it, right? But if it's not, if it's just communication, embrace the English that you have. Embrace the English that you speak, that you use, that may be flawed sometimes, that you may miss the words, how to say some things, that the pronunciation is not good, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter, because English as a lingua franca is not a language of any native community. English as a lingua franca is a tool for communication. This is what we're doing here. We're using English to communicate our ideas, right? So it is a fact. It is a fact that English is the most chosen foreign language in schools, in societies, a language of communication when people do not speak the same language. There are no exact numbers of speakers of English, but usually most linguists refer to at least 2 billion people. Of course, 2 billion people with varying degrees of competence, right? Some people can express their ideas more competently, meaning they can engage in several discussions, several topics. Others might be more limited in terms of vocabulary, in terms of development of ideas, in terms of grammar, right? So you have 2 billion people, 1/3 of the human race learning English, but with different degrees of competence. And nowadays, 21st century, we've got to the point that knowing English is a fact, right? You may have kids at home of different ages, or you know people who have small children starting schooling at the age of 7 or 8, and they are expected to start from the very beginning to learn English, right? As opposed to most likely when you guys and we started learning English, which was a little bit later. We're already adolescents or not as young learners as today. So slowly, the age of starting learning English is becoming more and more younger, right? How young, we don't know, but it's younger, right? And again, something that we should keep in mind is this distinction between English as a lingua franca and English as a foreign language, which is the traditional approach. English as a foreign language, we learn English to communicate with natives, right? So we used to do that. The textbooks, the teachers would emphasize the aim, the objective of learning English so that you could engage in discussions and conversations with the British, with Americans. Not even South Africans or Australians. This is very recent. So basically the focus was on the UK and the US, to know their culture, to read their literature, right? So the focus was linguistically and culturally the US and the UK, right? But this is exactly the opposite if you look at English as a lingua franca. The world is our aim, right? And as I said a while ago, pretty much, I don't know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the focus was on UK and US languages and cultures, varieties and cultures, but more recently, other Englishes, and that's, don't think it's strange to use the word English in plural, but it's exactly to identify the idea that there are more English varieties rather than British and American, right? So as well as much important as these two, we should also know something about other varieties of English, right? Because we cannot take it for granted that the native speaker that will cross that door and come talk to us is going to be American. Maybe Indian, maybe South African, maybe New Zealander, right? And we should know. I don't know if it's here, but all right. There's something else about that I wanted to add. So going back to the idea of learning English pretty much earlier, right, in terms of school years, school age, Braddoll just given this idea of proximity of cultures, not only you have that, sometimes cultures clash, right? So the problems that might exist in the minds of the children is not because of the bilingualism, biculturalism, but because of the cultures represented are in conflict. Bilinguals have to translate from their weaker to their stronger language. No, we're going to talk about that soon. But in fact, there's no weaker or stronger language. What we have is different competences, different uses for the language. So there's no weaker and stronger language, and there's no translation, right? Recent brain MRI scan, they've come up with the conclusion that the brain is engaged in the same way that one language is used, the other language is used. There's no translation, there's no creation of message in one first and then transferring that to another language. This might be, the creation of message, of meaning, may be simultaneous. Right? Children who grow up bilingual will make great translators when they grow up. No, not necessarily. They may, but they may not. Right? Because the skills for translating, but knowing two languages well enough to be able to translate the message from one language to the other, or vice versa, does not come from bilingualism, right? Because the necessary skills for good translation may be developed later, right? Even if we become bilingual at older ages, and we may become excellent translators as well. Real bilinguals never mix their languages. Those who do are confused semi-linguals. No, not true. Nowadays it is expected and accepted that we may mix languages, right? All in the matter of communication, right? So if it's necessary, if you have some need to mix languages to make yourself understood or to represent the cultures that you're from, so mixing is totally acceptable. Bilinguals have split personalities. I'm not going to say that, as if they were, medical cases, right? Let's open up the brain and. So it's, but that was true, right? Not true. It's true that some people thought about it, but not that it was true. Bilingualism is a charming exception, but monolingualism is, of course, the rule. We saw that before. I just wanted to keep that because these 10 old myths, they come together as a pack. Be very careful. If you don't follow the rules exactly, your children will never manage to learn both languages. Well, this has to do with bilingualism, home bilingualism. I'm not sure if that was the case with you guys, or if you know any couple, any family that raised bilingual children because parents spoke different languages, right? And the older idea was that there has to be a pattern, when a father talks to the child, it's only going to be in the father's first language as well as the mother, right? So the rules, you have to have a pattern so that the child is not confused. No, it's proven nowadays that there's no need to have any pattern, that parents may mix their languages, that the child may engage in conversations with parents or siblings or relatives in different languages. There doesn't need to be a pattern for the acquisition of the different languages the child is exposed to. And the 10th, you never manage to make him bilingual. Now, people really can't learn a language after age X. This has to do with learning languages at older ages. Again, no, of course, that's not true. If you want to start learning Russian, please do so. If you want to start learning Chinese, please do so. Of course, it has to do with language competencies, right? You will not reach possibly the level of a native speaker in a language because of the process of language acquisition. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn a language for instrumental purposes, right? We'll briefly talk about that. I put that, but it's two videos. I don't think it's necessary to show, but videos that talk about the assets of becoming bilinguals and multilinguals, right? You can find many in YouTube.
Mas pode usar a internet se precisar. Pode usar a internet se precisar.
Okay, there's
Pode usar, é só ligar. Está ligado.
So very briefly, just I don't want to get deeper into that, but just how this notion of bilingualism changed from early 20th century to later 20th century to what we have today. 1933, native-like control of two languages. Bilingualism meant you are able to do with 2 languages what you do with one only, right? Total competence, not what we need to understand bilingualism today. Bilingualism begins when the speaker of one language can produce complete, meaningful utterances in the other language. So you learn one language first and then another later? No. Incipient bilingualism, the initial stages of contact between the languages. These ideas today do not exist, right? So we can say with definite truth that we are bilinguals, right? We are at least bilinguals. But then you say, oh, but I don't know English that much. I mean, I don't speak English as a native speaker. We're not talking about competence of native speakers. We're talking about competence to engage in conversation and expressing your ideas. So if you do that Spanish, with Portuguese, with English, with French, with limited knowledge of Italian for any other non-Italian speakers, so you are multilingual. You are bilinguals. Definitely, and you may be multilinguals, maybe plurilinguals, right? So the question that exists here that we don't put anymore is that what's the absolute minimal proficiency required in order to be bilingual? Right? It's difficult to say, right? You can attend classes of a language for 1 semester, for 1 year, and you may already have competences to say something in that language and use that language with other speakers, right? And that's a different level of bilingualism. So a person can be bilingual to a certain degree, yet not be able to produce complete, meaningful utterances. So there is a distinction between productive and receptive skills. You may be bilingual in other languages and not be able to produce the language, but you listen to it and you understand it. You read the text and you understand the text. But if people ask you, let's talk in this language, oh no, I can't speak. I don't have the competences to speak. I read very well, but I can't speak. So you are bilingual. And you use that skill for certain competences. Right? So, same idea. Let's take that. I just wanted to focus on that. Yes. So basically, you have to understand bilingualism. And when I say bilingualism, I'm also saying multilingualism and plurilingualism. There are 4 questions. You have to understand the degree of that bilingualism, the function, the alternation, and the interference. These are the 4 aspects to use. What we mean by each one of them. The degree is what's the question you asked about degree? How well does the bilingual know each of the languages, right? It's not a statement. You have to know it as a native. It's just a question. How well do you know it? And the function, the uses a bilingual speaker has for the languages and the different roles they have in the individual's repertoire. You can just learn the language to be a reader. You like Russian literature, so you're going to study Russian to read literature in the original version. Alternation, the extent to which the individual alternates between the languages, and interference, the extent to which the individual manages to keep the languages separate or whether they are fused, right? So these are the key issues in understanding what we do with our languages, the languages that we speak and use. So this is a visual representation of what we can, how we can understand our competences. So the first thing is that you understand how you use the skills. How well do you listen? How well do you read, speak, and write in that language? Considering that we're talking bilingualism, so there's language A and there's language B. So what levels do we apply for each of these skills? The phonological, grammatical, the lexical, the semantic, and stylistic. That's proposed by Mackay, how you measure degrees of bilingualism. So your listening, your phonological skills in language A may be really good. English. In language B, not so much. But you can read grammatically accurately in language B. So you put that Russian. You can speak and use good vocabulary in Italian, but you cannot write making distinctions between formal language, informal language, right? So you cross the information that you have about your competences in the languages and the skills that you use the language, right? And again, there's no necessary connection between ability in one level and another. So you may have a very good pronunciation when you speak a language, but your grammar may be faulty. You don't remember the rules. You make mistakes, grammatical mistakes, but you have an excellent pronunciation, or vice versa. So competence in one level does not imply competence in another. So in practice, there are interdependencies between levels. So the development of speaking skills come with listening skills. So sometimes they are related, right? When you're talking about productive, receptive, and interactive skills. So the idea of balanced bilingual, or also called ambilingual, somebody who is fluent in both languages, is pretty much debatable, even though there are people, right? But this is not the only way to approach bilingualism. And of course, again, different attitudes, different cultures may have different notions of what it means to be a competent member of a particular language community. So different cultures, different individuals as well. So as I put here, the last line, the notion of balanced bilingualism is an ideal one. You should not strive and look at it as a challenge to become competently fluent in both languages, because there is always going to be differences in competences, right? So, and now our link to the more practical aspect of this talk, which is, remember that I mentioned a while ago that I was going to present two ways of intensifying the student's exposure. The first one is the one that you as an example, with Lil, right? The second one, exactly, we finished now, is bilingualism, bilingual education. And the next one, language learning supported by self-learning with digital resources such as online vocabulary exercises, mobile phone apps, online games. So I'm not going to go into depth in understanding the pedagogy of using mobile apps or something, right, in our classroom, because I think that it's pretty much a challenge nowadays. I don't know if you try to do it. In language learning classes, it's becoming more accessible, not only to move beyond paper, pen, textbook, and use electronic devices, the internet, all right? So I'm going to provide some examples for that. So, but before that, what are the benefits? What are the benefits of using electronically supported pedagogy activities? First, language learning. It provides language learning in the outside world. Remember that we were questioning the amount of exposure our students had in the classroom, but they don't learn the language only in the classroom. They may learn the language outside the classroom as well. So, and electronic devices provide opportunities for that. Real content versus the traditional language textbook. So, not as a challenge, and I'm not saying that we should leave textbooks out, but besides using textbooks, language constructed for that purpose, let's use the real content language, right? The one that the students will engage in outside the classroom. And of course, another benefit is that it encourages learners to engage with their own learning. They are responsible. They become responsible for their own learning. It's pretty much less teacher-centered, teacher-guided, but it's more student-centered. They are responsible for the activities themselves. And number 4, the last one, enables students to become autonomous language learners. So students can do much more when they're not with. So again, I should have put that before because it has to do with why are we doing this? Because we have the feeling that the outcomes are inadequate, right? The more we try to do something with language, the more we try to engage students in meaningful activities, we have that feeling at the end of the school year when we look at the results, it's like, that's not what I expected. I wanted my students to become more competent speakers, right? And just as a curiosity, in 2010-11, the European Commission that you teachers and they students will see language acquisition, right? Based on the policies, the national policies. So, and pretty much to end this part, I think I said that I mentioned a while ago that usually you have a plus approach. First you learn one language, your native language, and then you learn another language, which is English, and then eventually you may learn another foreign language, French, Spanish, Italian, whatever, and then another one. So this is a traditional approach of addition, right? So you add to it, right? But a more recent concept, a more recent suggestion is that instead of this one language plus another following another, we should have a plurilinguistic approach. So, in other words, what I'm saying is several languages at the same time. Don't worry about it. Your students will not freak out because they have, I don't understand anything, you have English, I have French. No, exactly the opposite. They will gain from it. So what is it that we expect from a plurilinguistic approach? So you set goals for acquiring competence in particular languages to different degrees. To expose students. So you have here, so I don't know how you guys are doing your mini projects, how far you've done, right? I don't know how you are engaging in different contexts. But if you put Turkish group with the Italians, with the Portuguese, and you engage in activities and exchanging projects, activities in which the Portuguese and the Spanish students will contact Turkish, and I'd say the same thing, right? And Italian and Dutch, whatever, right? Because you are developing different degrees of languages. And even if you're not developing competencies, there's something that I'm going to show next, you're developing language awareness. So by exposing your students to other cultural realities, to other languages, they become aware of this diversity and they accept differences more easily, right? So you are not going to engage in projects expecting to develop A2, B1 level competence in your students in Turkish of Portuguese, from your Portuguese teammates. No, at least the awareness of what the Portuguese language is, of what the Portuguese culture is. So what you're giving your students is a variety of plurilingual repertoires, right? With different outcomes. Imagine it by the end of this project, your students may introduce themselves and greet others in Turkish, in Italian, in Dutch, in Portuguese, in whatever, okay? Right? It's a language awareness that you are providing. You're not providing high-level competences. So what is it that we want for language learning in the 21st century? We want it to be plurilingual and asymmetric. It's not one size fits all. We don't need the same expectations for different languages. Different languages, different competences, different expectations. Very asymmetric. The experience and learning out of school. Let's crash the classroom walls, metaphorically speaking, of course, and have our students engage with real content, learning, language use in the streets, on the internet, right? And, of course, eventually, the intercultural understanding, right? Because, as I said in the very beginning, multilingualism comes hand in hand with multiculturalism, right? So a flexible model which differentiates language goals for a range of languages. Different languages, different goals and competences, and even language awareness, right? This is what I think we are in a fertile ground as you guys represent this exactly multilingualism and multiculturalism, right? So, how to do that? I'm going to just provide examples, right? And maybe, I don't know if someone else gives some ideas there, right, of examples of Web 2.0 apps and websites if you want to create online content easily and quickly. And I'm also taking for granted that when we say online, if you do something back home in Spain, everyone here will have access to what you do, because online has no frontiers, has no borders, right? So everyone will have access to it. How you do it easily and quickly, how you provide real-time collaboration so you can have your students in Spain working at the same time with students in the Netherlands, at the same time working with students in Turkey, how to write online, again, collaboratively or not, exchanging texts, how to create online learning games, how to develop student digital portfolios, how to create online slideshows, how to create online animations, how to create online comic strips. I chose these ones because I think that they cater for the motivation and the needs and the pleasures that your students might relate to, right? Comic strips, animations, slideshows. So starting with how to create online content easily and quickly. Oh, by the way, I mean, you can take pictures and everything, but I brought photocopies, right? Yeah. So at the end, I'm going to give you this. I'm going to give you this, right? So you can access. Can you please help me with the internet? What should I do?